Welcome back, everyone, after your lunch. Hope everyone's re-energized. So first up today, we have Bailey Britz, and I will just introduce Bailey. So Bailey holds a National Intelligence postdoctoral grant and is based at the iCinema Lab at UNSW. At iCinema, she organizes a research program in augmented decision-making. She's trained in literary studies and philosophy and works with computer scientists to find new solutions to wicked problems in artificial intelligence. I just love the sound of this combination. She has interests in AI and semiotics, abductive narratives, storytelling and decision-making, motivated speech, and complex systems theory. And Bailey is talking about misalignment and the fable.
Thank you very much. All right, hopefully this mic is working. The irony is you say so many clever things about technology and then you can't work a mic. I'm always really aware of that. So my name is Bailey. I'm based at UNSW, but I live in Melbourne. I'm on an O&I postdoctoral grant for the next 2.5 years. I've done about 1.5 years of it. And I'm really keen to speak to people who are working at the interface of artificial intelligence and narrative or storytelling or language. I work on, my grant title is Motivation Sensitive Machine Reading. So I'm particularly interested in the questions of motives and intentions, which of course come up here. So I'll keep an eye on the time because I realized I've got a very long paper. And I've got heaps to say. So I'm going to talk to you about alignment fables. But really, I'm only going to get to the time to talk about one alignment fable and compare it to one Aesop fable as something that might typify what we know about animal fables. But there are heaps of alignment fables, and hopefully in the longer written version of this, I'll be able to look at fables by a range of authors as well. So just to kind of foreshadow that, one of the things I'm trying to point out is something about a bit of a genre that exists online, right? Even though I'll only be analyzing one text for the sake of time. So most of you will know about alignment, probably from Twitter. Alignment is a research and technical practice area that's concerned with the safety of AI, particularly the potential contradictions between AI motivations and values. So the question of AI motivations is fascinating because AI is not a self or an entity. And we were talking a little bit about, morality in relation to AI. But you nonetheless have these kind of avatars of what we would call motivation, right? So that's what alignment is concerned with. So it's not AI ethics, which deals with things like rights and the entitlements of AI machines and their interaction with humans. It's focused on developing reliable AI systems that perform as intended in a wide range of conditions, including unexpected or adversarial scenarios. And that's where alignment gets really interesting, where you're dealing with an adversarial scenario, I think. So one of the key preoccupations of the field is the inability to adequately specify goals for AGI, a subsequent loss of control over this intelligence, and then the exponential nature of intelligence development. So these potential human failings can, for the alignment theorists, be apocalyptic. I've always been struck, as I'm sure everybody else has, by the apocalypticism of alignment theorists online. But it seems to be, the apocalypticism seems to be something of a virus. Every time I pick up a new New York Times bestseller about AI, one of the first things they say in the pages is, I've been in tech for 20 years and now I'm worried I'm going to, destroy humanity or something like that. It's a really interesting kind of stylistic, tick that happens in the prefaces to a lot of these books. And I'm really interested in its persistence across a range of genres and for a range of audiences. So what I'm going to do is compare an Aesop fable to the primarily internet-based genre of alignment fables to show how the fable offers a forum in which to consider the nature of the hierarchies of species and the paradoxes of evolutionary replacement. So topics Chris deals with in his important book on fables and animals. And I think what's really striking to me here is that this is essentially my point, right? Is that the shift from animals to machines doesn't change or put new demands on the genre in the context of these alignment fables, right? One of the things I was expecting as somebody who's trained in literary studies is, oh, they're going to innovate the genre to account for the new ways in which machines have motives and morality and intention. But I think actually we find the opposite. I think what we've got is a situation where the genre speaks back to alignment concerns in a really, really interesting way. And I'll argue that this is because the fables always dealt with the artificiality of intelligence, including and especially in Aesop, right? So alignment fables are didactic tales, and they're sometimes classed as thought experiments, which primarily reveal the limitations of human minds dealing with artificial minds. So Robert Garaci, who's written a wonderful text on apocalypticism and AI, claimed that popular science authors in robotics and artificial intelligence have become the most influential spokespeople for apocalyptic theology in the Western world. And I'm really interested, if anybody wants to talk about this later, in the intersection between theology and interfaces like alignment. I think we have a really interesting resurgence of ontotheology in AI theorization, and this is, I'm not against theology, but this is both worrying and interesting to observe. So there's a long history of the association between apocalypticism and AI theorization, including and especially by technical innovators from Norbert Wiener to Ray Kurzweil with the singularity to Marvin Minsky. You read these really wonderful texts published in the 60s and 70s by the first cyberneticians, and we find alignment fables in these texts reliably, written by Minsky, written by Wiener, written by Kurzweil, and they're all very similar. They all take the form of these thought experiments, which are now rewritten by alignment theorists online, sometimes on Twitter. So I'll use Nick Bostrom's definitional descriptions of a superintelligence to exemplify the association between AI and the apocalyptic very well. So I'm using Bostrom because because of his classic book, but also because I think everybody echoes these definitional requirements for superintelligence. One, superintelligence may be the last invention humans ever need to make. That's Bostrom. So the idea that a singular technology eclipses the need for other technologies, it's hierarchical. Form here is so important because this is how I'm going to connect alignment to the fable, right? These core forms that are articulated by people like Bostrom, yeah? So the idea of the hierarchy. Superintelligence will lead to more advanced superintelligence, so exponential growth. The emergence of superintelligence may be sudden, so it's event-like, not incremental. So the formal notions of exponentiality, the event, and then the hierarchy and replacement that hierarchies imply, right? Are all core tenets of the theorization of AGI or superintelligence, depending on who you're reading. And I think that's pretty consistent. So although figures like Bostrom and Kurzweil will take very different approaches to the prospect of an AGI, the structure of its emergence is strikingly similar in their writings. And it's these threats posed by superintelligence and our limits to understanding superintelligence that these alignment fables address. So perhaps the most iconic alignment fable is one you've no doubt all already heard, which is the paperclip fable, right? It's the paperclip fable when it's written by Bostrom. It's the squiggle maximizer story when it's written by Yudkowsky. It's the Riemann hypothesis story when it's written by Minsky, right? And there are heaps of others. And this is, an interesting trait of the genre of the fable as it is, because it's rewritten. It's an iterable genre, right? And in the sense it resembles a thought experiment, something that's iterable, but something for which, and I think in the sense it's a generic text as well, some of these fables, in that you can replace the content, right? But you've got these essential forms that are kind of persistent, right? So these qualify as machinic fables, though neither Bostrom nor Yudkowsky would call them fables as such, though Wiener has a really interesting theorization of the fable in his book God and Golem. So both of these figures are obviously core to alignment, but these are not the only figures that are writing fables. I'm thinking of Richard Ngo, who was a research engineer at DeepMind. He's now in the governance team at OpenAI, and Mark Zhu of the Alignment Research Center, but also the psychiatrist and writer of the Rationalist blogs, which is the blog Slate Star Codex and Astral Codex, Scott Siskind. These figures have all also written fables. And the Less Wrong website, which is the kind of online home of rationalists, ran a fable writing contest last year. So it's kind of interesting the way this genre cleaves to a certain moment in alignment theorization across the tech world. These are not necessarily writers who are just taking up this content. It's tech people who are moving into the fiction world in order to write these fables, right? So intuitively, the combination of symbolism, didactic purpose, and social critique make the fable appealing to alignment thinkers. And there are three other reasons I think that make the fable kind of formally interesting for alignment thinkers. One is the preoccupation with hierarchies of species and evolutionary replacement, which evokes the realm of animals that pertain to the fabular form, right? So all of our precedents, one of the interesting things about AI and the possibility of AGI is that we have no real precedent for what a general machinic intelligence might look like, but we go back to what we know about animals and what we know about replacement structures in evolutionary terms. Now, the question of evolution and AGI is a massively contentious one, and there's a lot of interesting writing being done on this. So I think paradoxically, AGIs are regularly figured as exempt from the evolutionary development of cognition, and as such, they're not subject to evolutionary pressures that create normative social and moral frameworks, right? I think that's kind of the standard narrative of machines being exempt from evolution. Now, I think this is contested by people like Catherine Hales, right? Who will talk about sort of co-evolution between humans and machines and so on. But just to kind of flag these thought structures that determine the way in which we think about machines and evolution. So the AGI that will have profound evolutionary consequences for humans holds this power precisely because it is an exception to the law of evolution and does not have evolutionary developed moral cognition. I think that's the way in which it's usually framed. We can contest that. I'm sure we will. The other two reasons, so one is evolution and hierarchies of species. Two other potential reasons involve the primacy of revelation for the exponential intelligence increases, right? And thirdly, the shock of other minds, central to the form of the fable. I think you see this especially in Aesop, right? There's this kind of repeated structure of the shock of other minds, right? Where somebody thought differently or didn't follow your logical system or your system of accountability, and as such, the intentional agent is upended, right? And these, of course, correspond to Bostrom, right? So the question of revelation for exponential increases, the shock of other minds to do with the sudden event-like appearance of AGI, and then evolution and hierarchies of species. So the idea that an AGI might be the last invention humans ever make, right? So these three traits, which I've just outlined, are all typical of Aesopian fables. So let's consider, for instance, the fable of the ass and the fox, right? Which I've just taken off the same website somebody else was using, where they're all kind of cataloged by an American government website. So the ass and the fox, and of course there are many, you all know this fable, and there are many versions of it with slightly different morals, right? So again, going back to the iterability of the genre. The ass and the fox, having entered into partnership together for their mutual protection, went out to the forest to hunt. They had not proceeded far when they met a lion. The fox, seeing imminent danger, approached the lion and promised to contrive for him the capture of the ass if the lion would pledge his word not to harm the fox. Then, upon assuring the ass that he would not be injured, the fox led him to a deep pit and arranged that he should fall into it. The lion, seeing that the ass was secured, immediately clutched the fox and attacked the ass at his leisure, right? And the moral of the story is, betray a friend and you'll often find you've ruined yourself. So, just to kind of describe or explain the story, the fox had believed that the system of exchange that he proposed would be adequate to save his own life. The fox committed deceit and betrayal, expecting his act of service to preclude the lion from doing the same. And just as the fox proves that he is not accountable to the ass, so too does the lion prove that he is not accountable to the fox. And trustworthiness here, of course, depends on power. Accountability works in one direction only in the food chain. It's up. And in dishonoring his contract with the ass, the fox exposes himself to the same ruin that he inflicts upon another. Okay. So kind of standard animal fable fare. So we might adopt a term from AI to explain this fable, the utility function, right? Which is comes from with it's a mathematical concept which we get from economics and game theory, and it's one of these ones that was imported into AI to become part of the standard model of AI, right? So it's really kind of a 20th century artifact, the utility function, but of course it's still used in a whole bunch of AI systems, and it's exactly the sort of function that alignment theorists are really worried about, been imported into AGI, right? And this is one of the problems, like just as a side note, in talking about artificial intelligence as something that's homogeneous, right? Is that we're shifting massively between talking about, you know, AI systems in the 90s to AI systems now, many of which AI systems are still working on a standard model in ways that, you know, LLMs are not. And we've kind of got all these, we've kind of got a confluence of different models, right? And they're all grouped under this problematic term, artificial intelligence. So just to kind of note that. So a utility function, I think I've explained it. It assigns a numerical value, a utility to every possible choice, where higher values represent more preferred outcomes. In artificial intelligence, utility functions are used for decision-making processes, and the agent's goal is to maximize its utility function, making decisions that lead to the highest possible utility, right? Pretty simple. The fox's decision to betray the ass represents a short-term utility gain. However, this decision overlooks the long-term utility of maintaining the trustworthy partnership. The lion's predictable behavior, which is maximizing prey capture, shows that short-term gains can lead to overall utility loss for the fox when trust is broken. So this kind of slightly clunky migration of terms from AI into literary theory or literary analysis, pretty basic literary analysis, is useful because it helps us to think through motives, right? And the different ways that, the different guises motives take in our world, in our cybernetic world. What we have in this fable is different minds, which are distinguished by their adherence to utility functions in a hierarchical framework. The imaginative correlate for abstract power structures is the food chain, and the animals adhere to their archetypal characters to express both a position in a hierarchy, but also a mental priority. So the ass is faithful and trustworthy and low in the food chain. The fox is cunning and treacherous and higher up than the ass in the food chain. And then the lion is a symbol of sovereign power and is the apex predator, right? But we actually don't need the food chain pyramid here as an explanatory device. All we need is the greater capacity to max out a utility function. And I think this is where we have the alignment theorists come in. What we can see is that these models of power structures linking intelligence to utility is kind of ready-made for the import into alignment theory and the concerns of alignment theorists. So here's the paperclip fable by Nick Bostrom. This is the one that's written by Nick Bostrom, right? So imagine an artificial intelligence which decides to amass as many paperclips as possible. It devotes all its energy to acquiring paperclips and to improving itself so it can get paperclips in new ways while resisting any attempt to divert it from this goal. Eventually, it starts transforming, first of all, Earth, and then increasing portions of space into paperclip manufacturing facilities, right? And this is kind of one of the most popular fables that illustrate the potential in the quickest and most efficient possible terms that illustrate the impending apocalypse, right? That these alignment fabulists are concerned with. So many fables are iterations of other fables, and this is no different. Marvin Minsky wrote about a machine that was charged with solving the Riemann hypothesis, and this is almost a better fable, right? Because the paperclip factories, you can get diverted very easily into kind of industrial imaginaries and so on. But I think with the Riemann hypothesis, it's even better, right? Minsky suggests that such a machine might take the Earth to be a resource for this problem and transform everything into a giant computer. The threat here, we must remember, is not paperclips or the impending giant computer, but the fact that an unaligned machine was built. The fact of our inability to stipulate goals for these agents. And in the case of the Aesop fable, the poor foresight of two of the three animals. So the threat's not the death of the animals, but the foresight, right? Like the fox in the earlier fables, humans are architects of their own downfall because they don't accurately grasp hierarchies created by utility functions. Like other fables, the story sets up a hierarchy that is unobserved or poorly grasped by the characters, leading to the subversion of expectations, particularly regarding another mind, right? And ultimately ruin. When we think about the advent of an AGI, we can lapse into thinking about, or we can lapse into just thinking about superintelligence. But the point is that here is that power is always created in these stories, right? I'm not making a statement about power. By the masked coupling of intelligence and utility function, right? Or intelligence and goal. And I think this is consistent across Aesop and the alignment fables, right? So there are two key concepts that these alignment fables are meant to illustrate. And these are intuitive concepts that we would know philosophically anyway, because we've dealt with them for a long time. One, and these, Eliezer Yudkowsky came up with these. One is the orthogonality thesis, which posits that a high machinic intelligence does not align necessarily or prospectively with human morality or goal structures. The fable sees a failure to correctly anticipate the intersection between intelligence and utility, just as the fox fails to anticipate the utility held by the lion. The other thesis that this fable illustrates is instrumental convergence. So instrumental convergence is the hypothesis that diverse intelligence agents will converge in similar sub-goals because these sub-goals are instrumental in achieving a wide range of final goals. So hence the preoccupation with resource acquisition, right? That would be an instrumental goal that leads to paperclips or the Riemann hypothesis. These instrumental goals or instrumental convergence kind of explains a lot about the persistence of these forms in alignment fables. So the shared sub-goals between the ass and the fox allow them to form a partnership for mutual protection. Their primary goal, their utility function, is staying alive. The fox believes that by betraying the ass and securing the lion's promise not to harm it, it'll increase its chances of survival. This reflects the idea that agents might adopt or shift strategies when faced with competing convergent instrumental goals. They have a momentary convergent instrumental goal, which then ends the very second that the ass has been secured, right? In the Aesop tale, the fox facilitates an instrumental goal for the lion, but this is a service, not a shared goal, right? And they are at no point real allies. So I'll skip over the other fable that I was going to talk about, the wish fulfillment fable by Yudkowsky, just to go into a kind of a reflection on the commonalities between the Aesopian animal fables and these alignment fables. The commonalities are striking, right? I think hopefully what I've proved is that the kind of the persistent and conventional form of the fable fits quite perfectly with the formal structures that characterize our imaginations about the appearance of a superintelligence. Although it's often argued in AI literature that the problem of alignment comes about precisely because the AI is not shaped by evolutionary pressures and hence compelled by social integration, for instance, we see the same exemption from evolutionary norms and traits in the animal fable. The Aesop fable shows that there's a disjunction between evolutionary pressures at every level in the food chain, right? So the evolution's not a hill, it's a staircase, right? Which the animals can't climb up. So the Aesop fable shows that there's a disjunction between evolutionary pressures. The absence of real instrumental convergence between animals in this tale suggests that this is not really a unique and unprecedented divergence between humans and machines, right? In the paperclip fable, this is not a category break. It's how competing utility functions have always functioned, right? This is something that's persistent and not novel, I would argue. The exceptionalism that we see in the AGI or the superintelligence in the paperclip fable is consistent rather than divergent from systems of exceptionalism that we find between species. The lion doesn't follow the rules of the fox. He doesn't have to because he's higher up in the hierarchy, right? So while the fox is exempt from the rules that govern the ass, right, and the accountability systems that govern the ass, so too is the lion then exempt, is the exception from the rules that govern the fox, right? And this is a surprise to the fox. The fox had not correctly anticipated that. So whether this is agreement, whether this is takes the form of an agreement between animals that's reneged on, or an instruction by a human that a machine misinterprets, I think that this confluence of the other minds, the utility function, and the revelation of those other minds is consistent across these fables. So it's often noted that animal fables are characterized by artificiality. In particular, it's the grafting of human intelligence onto animal characters that creates stories that stage, I think, the artificiality of intelligence, right? In the Aesop stories, for instance, we know that the characters, this is how we know the animals possess intelligence, right? How do we know that the animals are not real animals? How do we know that they're chimerical, right? And that they're here to teach young humans about how to be human, really? How do we know about that? Precisely because of the operations of the artificiality of intelligence, right? We know that the characters possess an intelligence that is partly human because it involves language, certain skills and forms of tool use that exceed the animal's capacities, and the creation of alliances and contracts that imply a human sociality and intellect. This effect, this artificiality, is not a secondary effect of the chimerical rendering of these stories. It's a primary characteristic of intelligence. In these stories, we see intelligence not as an inherent or natural attribute, but something that is constructed and mediated through systems, tools, and languages. Evidence of human general intelligence is only ever found in the narrative accounts of tools, language, and strategies. Intelligence is also mediated by the biological material realities of the species, but also by the abstractions of utility functions and the instrumental convergences of goals. Really different things, right? So languages, systems, and tools, right? They don't share a space in a kind of mental map similar to the utility function, right? And the biological materiality of the food chain, for instance, that we see in the Aesop fable, right? This intelligence is distributed and mediated here, right? It is at the level of representation, it is artificial. So to conclude, the realities of this artificiality are, in both fables, illustrated by the paradoxes entailed in language. We can read these as fables of language, the simultaneous materiality and immateriality of words, the paradox of their literal signification and their holistic meaning, and the constancy of the word and its cultural malleability. The problem in both these fables is nobody does what they say or does what they're told to do, right? There's a split between behavior and language, right? All of this is about the distinction between saying and acting, and in each case, the problem is the same. Saying does not exhaust action, and action does not exhaust saying either. It does not limit or fully account for it. The disjunction between language and the world needs to be managed or imagined if we are to avoid catastrophes, not resolved, right? So I'd argue that in the alignment tales, we see the AGI as threatening because it may make the decisions of animals, but this animal intelligence is always already artificial. Catastrophe is always threatened by the artificiality of intelligence. But attempting to diagnose precisely the artificiality as the problem, as a threat, which I think is what the alignments do, is misconceived, right? The artificiality being the split between saying and acting, for instance. The artificiality being the mediation of intelligence through things like utility function or a biological reality. So as with all fables of intelligence, here we see a picture of human intelligence in the alignment fables, which is always already not human, and a native capacity that is always already artificial. But I think that this is problematized in alignment rather than read as something that is consistent and is consistent about intelligence. So I think for alignment in these fables, the only thing that would mitigate the threat, right, is to try to fuse saying and acting. Right? At one point, Yudkowsky says that the only safe genie is a genie where you can say, I wish for what I wish for, right? And you don't have to explain your wish. And we know this from, sort of 17th century fairy tales. Every time a genie appears and says that they can grant you 3 wishes, what you need to do is run away. And I think this is what Yudkowsky is getting at. What we need to do to align these machines is to make it do what we say and to fuse that gap. And what he's problematizing without realizing is the native artificiality of intelligence, right? Okay. So intelligence is always already chimerical in fables. It's a mix of human and animal and human and machine, and it's always already artificial. So understanding the link between these fables, the alignment fables and the Aesop fables, can help us develop a theory of intelligence, but also help us to locate concept around this, also help us to locate the hysteria around the very concept of the artificial. All right, thank you. I was pretty much on time.
Thank you, Bailey. That was extraordinarily rich. I think we'll have a lot of ongoing conversations. Monique is going to be talking about A Fable of a Narrating Brain in Andrea Longchu's China Brain 2021. Monique Rooney teaches US literature, film and television in the English program at the Australian National University. The author of Living Screens, Melodrama and Plasticity in Contemporary Film and Television 2015. She's currently completing her forthcoming book, Brown Networks, Tastemaking in Contemporary American Art and Literature from Iowa University Press 2026.
Thank you. She gets there. These are the first 3 words of Andrea Longchu's China Brain, published in 2021 as an essay in the online magazine N+1. Chu is an American critic and writer whose star has risen in the past decade. She won a prize for this essay, which I consider literary and experimental, as it unfolds in part through the perspective of a protagonist referred to only as she. This focalization is crucial as it underpins the intelligence of she, as well as the significance of the place to which she gets. A description of this there begins her narrative. She gets there, and it's like someone's aunt has decorated the place. Big block colours and weird expressionist paintings, limbs and tits hanging out of colour fields, but also an oriental rug on the floor, zigzag throw pillows, boho Bauhaus, orange red, orange orange, and then just attic crap, old chairs, audio cables, yellowing books, jigsaw puzzles, a Rubik's Cube. The place is the waiting room of a medical office where she is to undergo transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, treatment for severe depression. The hodgepodge of tastes and objects characterising this place to which she gets makes it recognisable. The eclectic decor, with elements like an oriental rug and boho Bauhaus furnishings, signifies more than just omnivorous taste. The decor also evokes the liminality of the waiting room, and it is significant that it is this threshold space that introduces an essay that invokes a mind-body relation that is at once familiar and strange. In the essay's next paragraph, which moves from the waiting room to a medical room where she will be treated, a certain foreignness is emphasised. Firstly, she notes that it is her psychiatrist, wryly referred to as literally German and as Frau Doktor, who has recommended TMS. She then mentions that the slightly nutty psychiatrist who runs the place, who is called Dr. L, is Italian, inhabiting a tiny nation of one, her own private Monaco. The European background of both doctors treating her echoes the Freudian and more broadly psychoanalytic thought, traversing the essay's exploration of mental corporeal thresholds. In the previous paragraph, after describing the decor, she notices a porcelain replica of Fowler's phrenology head in the bathroom. She then sits in a big blue chair purchased at a discount from a folded dental practice next to a large model of a human ear covered in small Chinese characters for acupuncture training. Her handsy are poor, but she knows a few: heart, eyes. While the eclectic decor suggests a state of limbo or suspension readily identifiable with a medical waiting room, the phrenology head and the model ear for acupuncture training evoke medical systems from different eras and nations, notable for particular systems that have enabled knowledge about the workings of brain or other body parts. One of those, the American phrenology head, belongs to an outdated system. The other remains relevant, Chinese acupuncture. In this context, the phrase "she gets there" enigmatically introduces this work about a range of indeterminacies, including those relating the thinking brain to body, foreigners to familiars, as well as a narrative perspective, she, to persona or character. The narrative perspective is in part focalized through a she, whose English language perception and recording of the foregoing experience frames the narrative, yet recognizes a few handsy. As we shall see, however, Chu's essay complicates the very idea of a she who might be getting somewhere concrete or who might be definitively identified, such as in relation to the author whose byline, with its Chinese surname, precedes the opening sentence. This holds true even for those familiar with Chu's writing, who will likely recognise and connect elements of her wit and narrative style to her published accounts of medical treatment and surgery. A case in point is "My New Vagina Won't Make Me Happy," written in anticipation of her vaginoplasty in November 2018. Readers might also link the humorous reference to the German psychiatrist as Frau Doktor with Chu's interest in Freudian psychoanalysis, philosophy, and feminism. As previously noted, Chu's essay is structured like an experimental fiction. The literary flavour of the work is signalled with those opening words, "she gets there," and becomes more apparent with its unconventional narrative structure. The essay is divided into 12 sections, of which 6 focus on the she who is receiving TMS. The other 6 are narrated by an I that is also a brain, and that sometimes addresses the reader's brain. This structure complicates the notion that she simply represents Chu. She's been read autofictionally a lot, or autotheoretically a lot, suggesting the body appended to the brain that, speaking as an I, can be thought of as a kind of narrative, if not artificial intelligence, if we can use that phrase. This structure encourages thought about whether the there of "she gets there" refers to an indeterminate space between body and mind as much to the suspended space of the medical room. With its alternations between a she who undergoes TMS and an I, a narrating brain, the narrative structure is thus integral to an essay that thinks about the mind-body threshold, with repercussions for thought about the border between so-called natural and artificial intelligence. On one hand, the brain functions as the organ integral to the she who undergoes treatment. On the other hand, the brain acts as a first-person narrator, lacking a body yet capable of conveying what the body, which of course incorporates the brain, sees, hears, touches, tastes, and smells. This exemplary literary figure, the brain as narrative I, communicates from its cerebral perspective while supplementing the experience of the she who receives neurological treatment for depression. This brain, this narrating I, this artificial intelligence, first crops up in the first section of the essay after the TMS, first crops up in the second section of the essay after the TMS treatment has begun. Sorry, the first section. A TMS technician named Dennis fixes to the head of she a magnet that shoots 7 pulses of electricity into her brain. Dennis then asks she what she does for a living. "I'm a writer," she answers. "A writer," he smirks, turning back to the glow of his computer. "Are you going to write about this?" "Maybe," she replies, "probably a little fictionalized, some first-person stuff." "First person, what? Like you'll be the narrator?" "No," she says, "the narrator will be my brain." This narrating brain makes itself known in section 2, remembering that the sections alternate between she and then the narrating brain. The section begins, "Sorry for the runaround. I just wanted to make sure we could talk in private, you and me, brain to brain, if that's okay. It's your brain that's reading this right now on your computer or phone, or bless you, maybe in print, feeling the coarse weight of the paper stock under your fingers, which are your brain's fingers with their thousands of nerve endings. This eye appears to be the brain that she had mentioned to Dennis. Interestingly, while the essay structure is founded upon a division between the I, brain, and she, body, the brain introduces itself as being an integral part of the body, noting the coarse weight of paper stock. This connection suggests that the I emanates from the same body as the she being treated, blurring the distinction between brain and body and closing the temporal gap between writer and reader. Strikingly, however, the brain soon asserts that it is governed not by the body, but by itself. The brain continues, the truth is it's always the brain, reading or writing. It's always the brain talking or eating, having sex, not having sex, lying about why, apologizing for earlier, walking around the apartment wondering, where did I leave that thing? Saying, how could you do this to me? Asking, is this really happening? What will I do without you? Brains softly crying together, brains kissing brains goodbye. Here, the brain projects a sense of autonomy, but then contradicts this apparent self-governance by acknowledging its reliance on the body. The brain's claim that it is always about itself is, moreover, in tension with its earlier address to the reader's brain and fingers, with their thousands of nerve endings touching the coarse paper. It seems to me that what is at stake here is Chu's interest in the relation between the material and immaterial, a preoccupation that is integral to Chu's book, Females, from 2019, in which Chu develops her theory of femaleness as a negative ontology. Everyone is female and everyone hates it, Chu writes in this book, positing that femaleness is a universal sex that she defines as existential negation. This negation emanates from beings in thinking and desiring while inhabiting bodies that are necessarily lacking. For Chu, femaleness is any psychic operation where the self is sacrificed for another's desires. She describes femaleness as an ontological lack, a hollow self, and an incubator for an alien force. To be female is to let someone else desire for you at your own expense. In positing her ontological theory of femaleness, Chu engages with the work of writer Valerie Solanas, but also crucially with Freud's theory of sexuality. When I say that everyone is female, writes Chu, I am simply restating something psychoanalytically uncontroversial, namely that castration happens on both sides. Chu recounts how, for Freud, men as well as women represent, quote, partial, imperfect solutions to the universal threat of castration, unquote. Quote, the presence or absence of a literal penis is, it turns out, only incidental to castration anxiety. What matters is the idea of one, unquote. Chu refers to how Freud clarified this idea in a 1920 footnote to the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, where he states that, quote, women no less than men originally had a penis, unquote. And she then emphasizes how this castration complex becomes the cornerstone of his theory of sexual difference. But then Chu clarifies a further complexity of Freud's theory. For the little boy, Chu writes, the sight of the sister's genitalia gives rise first to denial, then to unwilling acceptance. While for the little girl, the discovery of the penis provokes a profound experience of envy, leading to neurosis, frigidity, and in extreme cases, lesbianism. Chu concludes this section of Females with her assertion that, quote, the castration complex is easily mistaken for the fear that one will be castrated. In fact, it is the fear that one, having been castrated, will like it. Pussy envy is therefore not the mutually exclusive opposite of penis envy, but a universal desire, atop which the latter develops as a reactive formation. Everyone does their best to want power because deep down, no one wants it at all. In females, both sexes are essentially castratable because desiring subjects who also have bodies whose genitals are found lacking compared to others. This is where intelligence, specifically artificial intelligence, comes in. In China Brain, Chu explores the relation between mental abstraction and embodiment, focusing on the brain as the central organ of the nervous system responsible for processing information, thought, cognition, intelligence, and coordinating motor control, muscle activity, and the endocrine system. There is a moment in the essay when technician Dennis uses a device to test the motor threshold of She undergoing TMS. She observes how he increases the power of this machine until her hand twitches, like he's tapping her brain with a little hammer to see if it kicks. Sensing her brain acting more like a leg than a brain, she, who is a writer, wittily draws attention to the difference between a literary and a science-based experience of the body. This raises the question of whether the mind-body relation is a threshold rather than a split or a division. This age-old question haunts the sensibility of the writer who undergoes TMS. And it is a question that comes to the foreground when the narrative shifts to the brain's perspective. This narrative shift resonates with Chu's interest in sexual lack in females, her argument that we are all female in that our thinking and desiring bodies ultimately find dissatisfaction and insufficiency. These ideas are also key to the essay's narrating how the essay's narrating brain functions in relation to the body. The narrating brain effectively asks these and other questions, such as where does the brain end and the body begin? And how do we distinguish between natural and artificial knowledge? How does what we taste or touch influence who we are and what we perceive? If the brain is an intelligence capable of intelligencing itself, as technician Dennis asserts at one point in the essay, how does this intelligence also function as a distributed intelligence responding to the actions of other people and objects? Such questions resonate further when the narrating brain recounts two thought experiments. Philosopher Ned Block's 1978 experiment called China Brain and John Searle's Chinese room argument from 1980. For the sake of time, I today focus solely on Searle's Chinese room argument, which, in the post-Turing context in which Searle investigated the relation between human and machine intelligence amidst arguments at the time about weak and strong AI. So he was effectively setting out to argue that AI at the time was not strong AI. To be clear, while Searle was arguing against the idea that computer programs are strong AI, he was not arguing that computers can't think nor that humans are not machines. Rather, Searle emphasized the physical architectural similarities between human brains and computers, proposing that humans are biological machines. But Searle also wanted to know whether a computer can produce an intentional state. And the so-called Chinese room argument was the thought experiment he came up with. In this scenario, a hypothetical Searle, sits in a room where he receives pages printed with Chinese characters. He has a set of instructions in English on how to manipulate these symbols. Searle orders or patterns the symbols as instructed and then sends them back out of the room. Here is the rub. Unknown to Searle, the characters form a story and a series of questions in Chinese, which he answers correctly without understanding Chinese. Searle argued that to an outside observer, it would seem as if he understands Chinese, thus passing the Turing test. For Searle, this thought experiment demonstrates that a computer programmer is not a human mind precisely because it can function like a brain without comprehending that it is doing so. Searle's human thinker discerns that a computer program can function like a human brain without knowing it is doing so. This negative ontology, knowing what something is in terms of what it is not, resonates with Chu's females. However, what intrigues Chu's narrating brain about Searle's experiment is its reliance on Chineseness. Chu's narrating brain surmises that Searle chose the Chinese language because it was alien. It was all Greek to him, quote unquote. Chu's narrating brain then speculates whether this is an example of intelligence uncomprehending itself, and whether this idea is further obscured by the use of Chinese characters. After recounting the AI thought experiments, Chu's narrating brain then devises the following thought experiment of its own in order to further investigate the question of Chineseness in relation to AI. In the narrating brain scenario, the year is 1900, not 1980. This time it is the narrating brain's Chinese great-great-grandmother sitting in a room arranged similarly to that in Searle's hypothesis. This woman is a literate member of the gentry, and she is able to read through the several stacks of papers in the room. She reads one stack and then another, answers questions and slides them under the door. The third and smaller stack comprises papers covered in strange, i.e. English symbols. She wonders with growing dread what they mean. One obvious implication of this story, if understood as a kind of scientific fable, is that the identity of the brain in the room matters. It is not only a woman in the narrating brain's thought experiment, but a Chinese woman living in 1900 in a Chinese province. She is literate, but not in English. The English language is foreign to her, represented by strange symbols. The spatial and temporal location and the body and brain within that location are foregrounded in this latter thought experiment in a way they are not in the other two experiments. Here, the background matters to the foreground. Both foreground and background, thought experimenter and hypothetical character thus matter in Chu's remaking of Searle's AI thought experiment, just as they matter to Chu's literary essay. The Chinese woman arrives in a room where she can read many, but not all of the symbols in the room. Similarly, Chu's she arrives in a medical waiting room where some objects and people are strange while others are familiar. Much of Chu's writing is readable as autofiction, and China Brain is no exception, as it aligns the brain's AI thought experiment with the Chinese great-great-grandmother that Chu has mentioned when discussing her family background. Whether understood as autofiction or scientific fable, the essay achieves something integral to the intelligence of a literary writer, the capacity to refer to background and foreground simultaneously. It is through the inextricable intertwining of text and context that China Brain delivers its essential meanings, including what it means to place side by side languages that may otherwise be considered alien to one another. I am thinking here of the printing of English words alongside the Hanzi for head and heart in the essay's opening. Chu's thought experiment about a 1980s AI thought experiment is coextensive with her essay's exploration of the body's relation to the brain, the head's relation to the heart, the English language writer's relation to the Chinese character. As a literary writer, Chu nimbly shifts among various registers, fiction and non-fiction, essay and experiment, foreground and background, while intelligencing and navigating disciplinary divisions and cultural hierarchies conditioning her thought. In China Brain, we have a literary writer who can make herself intelligible to a medical technician and vice versa. Similarly, we have a Chinese character strategically inserted within an English language story addressed to the brain of a reader. In Females, Chu develops her theory of femaleness as an ontological lack, conditioning the sexuality of both men and women. In China Brain, the literary writer, configured through a she, informed by Freudian psychoanalysis and a cerebral eye that observes this she, comes up with her own theory of intelligence. In a section following on from the narrating brain's AI thought experiment, she returns, but this time, and for the first time, she is outside the medical rooms. Now she is sitting in a noodle shop with a friend. They are talking about philosophy of mind, as if in response to the neuroscientific language integral to the treatment to which she has been subject. She says to her friend that she doesn't want to believe that how she feels is just an effect of neurons firing or whatever. She tells her friend that she is trying to work out an ontology where everything is equally real. Let's say objects only exist within their own systems, she says, crunching black fungus between her teeth. Like alpha waves do exist, but only as objects inside of neurobiology. I've only got 2 paragraphs left. I hope I'm not going over time. As she speaks, she does air quotes with her chopsticks to emphasize the words in quotations. The mention of the black fungus crunching and the chopsticks performing air quotes brings us to a live situation where bodies interact, hands gesticulate and mouths savor and crunch food. These objects that do their own thing within their own system can be thought of in relation to, but also somewhat removed from Chu's negative ontology of femaleness. In China Brain, by contrast, she imagines a situation where all persons, objects and things exist according to their own reality, without comparison, without lack. Informed by the author's experiences and her keen awareness of the psychic and literary structures at play in any given situation, Chu's China Brain is haunted by the age-old question of what the mind is in relation to the body. In addition, the essay brings a literary sensibility to the neuroscientific treatment of the body, which situation in turn extends to questions about AI. The final section of China Brain is narrated by the brain. The stupid end to this story, the narrating brain reports, is that the magnets didn't work. Didn't help, because what we didn't know then is that I am bipolar. Evidence for the success of transcranial magnetic stimulation in bipolar patients is partial at best, since excitation of the prefrontal cortex, like antidepressants, can trigger hypomania. Now my psychiatrist has me on lithium, a mood stabilizer. Whoops, going the wrong way. And lithium really is a metal. Unlike most drugs, lithium carbonate occurs in nature. Brain, how's your chemistry? If you want, you can synthesize lithium carbonate through what's known as a salt metathesis reaction. You just take lithium chloride from a salt flat in Chile, etc. In the reaction that follows, the sodium ions will give up their carbonate ion and receive the chlorine, leaving the lithium ions free to bond with the carbonate. Now you've got 2 new salts, NaCl, which you may recognize as table salt, and Li2CO3, the lithium salt of carbonate. And you won't know what brain, maybe I just wasn't getting enough salt. Here, the brain realizes that she may have been lacking a basic element required by the body, salt. This echoes an earlier section in which the brain had again addressed the brain of the reader, gently inquiring, I just want to check in, brain, how are you feeling? Do you need some water? You always need some water. Salt is the last word in an essay that grapples with whether intelligence is a locatable entity, a specific part of the brain that can be subject to TMS, or a distribution between the body, she and a mine, the brain plus the I, and others, the brains of readers and the eyes of readers, with a view to the enigmas and indeterminacies evoked when she first gets there. Intelligence, whether natural or artificial, might be seen as a transition, something that moves between like water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monique. Wow, that was amazing combination of papers. So I guess we'll have the 2, yes, we'll have questions. So at the back first, I guess. Sorry. Yeah, do you want?
Thank you so much for both of those papers. I really enjoyed them both. My question is for Monique, and it's not a particularly well-formed question, so I apologize for that. I just was really interested in the way that you were illustrating your sort of conversation about the sort of the Chinese room thought experiment, and also Chu's kind of reimagining of the Chinese room thought experiment with the AI generated images, and like just sort of reflecting on the role of like kind of garbled iconography in like the sort of in those images, because, you know, there is this sort of very like unknowable but also very recognizable quality that the sort of the attempts of AI image generators to sort of to create things that look like words but clearly are not words, and it just sort of seemed so resonant with the 2 stories that you were kind of talking about there. So I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on sort of the connections between those.
relation between the images in my PowerPoint, you mean, and what?
Yeah, and just the sort of, like I think just the sort of the way that AI attempts but fails to create things that look like, English letter symbols seems so sort of relevant to sort of the stories that you were talking about. So I thought you'd have a hot take that I could enjoy, essentially.
I don't think I do have a hot take, actually, Millie. And I've played around with ChatGPT quite a lot. And I was speaking to Jonathan before about whether or not it's legit to call ChatGPT AI at all. But I haven't asked it to come up with any names, any foreign names, but I have enjoyed using it for generating images. I don't really get the commentary that I sometimes see online and around where people say, oh, ChatGPT fails at doing images or it fails at writing poetry. I actually really like what it comes up with. I find it amazing. But I very much use it as a tool. And I'm kind of, I think really Chu doesn't have a point in that essay about AI, I don't think. But I imagine having a conversation with her where she would fall somewhere in the same region as John Searle, even though she wouldn't agree with philosophy of mind approaches, that this is weak AI. It's a tool. It's not causative. It doesn't intend to do things. So I would never expect it to know what to do unless I am guiding it in some way. And for me, that's at work in Chu's essay also, that idea.
I had a question actually for you, Bailey. And thanks so much for that theorization of the fable. I really enjoyed it. It was really, I think it's a question of just for you to say more about something, because you were talking about that distinction between saying and doing, which I find fascinating. So, fables are very much about that, sort of about how, characters in fables say something and what they do is totally different. My question is, why were you describing that as artificial, as sort of signifying the artificial? Because, in my head, it's sort of, there's a kind of almost, it's about hypocrisy. It's about, the narrative, like what happens, like a character says something and then does something else. So, I was just really fascinated by what you were saying about that being artificial, but I didn't quite. Could you just say more about that, or how you understand it?
Thank you. Get the technology right first. I think it's artificial for a whole bunch of different reasons. And I think that comes from the distinction between the human and animal. And I think that it comes from the distinction between the species. There are different, they're all intelligent, but there are different facilities for saying and doing at every level. And I think that when we see intelligence, we see it as artifice, right? So there's also the play on the connection between artificial and the artifice, right? But the idea that intelligence is always already artificial, because the way in which we view it in these fables is through these kind of mediating devices, right? So for the way in which there's a way in which saying relates to that, because there's a distinction between materiality and immateriality of words. So for instance, with the wish fulfillment fable or the paperclip fable, we stipulate a goal, but there's all these kind of immaterial factors and these contextual factors. There's the kind of, there's the existence of the word semantically and then the word semiotically, which causes all the problems, and causes the problems in Aesop, and it causes the problems in alignment fables as well. And then there's the distinction between the distinction between saying and doing is also interesting in terms of the distinction between desire and reality, right? And desire and event, and kind of the wish fulfillment structures that I think also kind of operate in these fables, and which are kind of, there's a fable called what is it called? It's literally called the fulfillment of wishes or something like that. And one of the problems with one of the ways in which we diagnose intelligence as artificial is because it always, and I think wrongly, is because it always cleaves towards the literal meaning of the word, right? And this goes back to the golem fables, right, where the original golem carries out instructions poorly. And I think that intelligence as an emergent phenomenon happens between those two things. And I think that's what one of the things that we see is that we see intelligence as emergent between these different facets of the story. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm amazed how much of this stuff comes back to the children's game Twisted Wishes. I don't know if your kids play that. You say something, I wish for that, and then the game is the person who's running it. But then this happens.
There was mention of self-awareness earlier on in terms of something about what's genuine intelligence. I kind of found that curious. It's not that hard to get a machine to pretend to be self-aware. So is this a useful test at all? Because
I was quoting from the essay.
Yeah.
When I used that phrase, it's an early part of the essay. I think the first section, no, a later section. So she's going back and forth for these TMS sessions, and Dennis and other technicians chat to her while they've got this magnet on her head, pulsing electricity into her brain. And at one point, Dennis suggests that she read a book called Rhythms of the Brain. I think it's a real book. It's referenced in the essay. I've not read it. I'm not an expert. She goes home and reads it, and she doesn't get much of it. Like, the language is very technical, so she doesn't think that she really gets it. But she gets the overall thesis, which is that the brain intelligences itself. And next time she's in TMS, Dennis is fixing the magnet to her head, and she says, oh, by the way, that book, I read it, and this is the thesis. And his eyes light up, and he's like, yes, you get it. The brain intelligences itself. And so he's proud that she gets it, because she's a literary writer, you see. And so whether or not she, the writer, who is also a character in the essay, really thinks that, I don't know. So there's a bit of a game going on here. Intelligence is somehow distributed between the writer, Andrea Longchu, and the character, she, and then this narrator, who she decides will be the brain, who is an I, capital I. So this intelligence is distributed through these. So I have a feeling that that Andrea Longchu perhaps doesn't think that intelligence is only self-intelligencing, the capacity for an organism, say, to reproduce itself or to plasticize itself. I think she thinks that human intelligence, at least, is something immaterial as well as that. So that's a long answer, but that's... Do you want to say anything?
Oh, I don't have anything to add to that. Yeah.
Thank you. This is going to be a bit garbled. I'm still digesting lunch and the papers too. So thank you so much for this rich session. This is for Bailey. I wanted to draw you out on the ontotheology point because you mentioned it at the beginning as an invitation to draw you out, and also related to your question earlier in the day about the importance of historicizing what we're talking about. I was completely on board with the artificiality point, being a concern with the split between the saying and the doing. And I know that a couple of people in today's talks have been interested in that period in the sort of 1890s, the sort of late 19th century, where artificiality was not only a concern for changing ideas about life in biology and those debates happening there in the life sciences, but also in aesthetics. So the art versus the importance of artificiality was connected particularly to aesthetics at that time, and that there was a sort of parallel idea that a certain type of faith was involved in the aesthetic realm. And a lot of the people writing at that time also are interested in, you know, the truth function of language and the fact that we can never say what we mean. And it's also, yeah, there's all those discussions going on. So I guess drawing you out on the ontotheology point and trying to think about whether artificiality is, or the type of sort of alignment fables you're talking about does represent some kind of re-emergence of ontotheology, or thinking about the sort of 1890s context, whether it is more about reclaiming something that's lost in the kind of swing towards behaviorism and maybe neo-Darwinianism as opposed to Darwinianism. We've lost something in that interpretation of Darwin, that the legacy is still here. So what is this, just a sort of swing against behaviorism rather than a theology? I don't know whether that's something, but anyway, just if you want to riff on that.
I think it could, I love that point, and I think it could be both, if that's possible, even though it seems paradoxical. I think I'm worried about ontotheology, right? And I wouldn't want to, I'm worried, well, what I would say is that I'm worried about a certain ontotheological impulse, right? Not like I wouldn't want to go and bash theology, because I think in fact it's actually probably our loss of theology that makes that sometimes lets these reflexes kind of run wild a little bit, especially in, you know, sort of instantaneous forums like online. But I am worried about the various implications that run around onto theologies, such as the messianism, but also the kind of reactionary version of messianism, because there's different versions of messianism. Some of them are really hopeful, you know, and sometimes it defines hope, right? But there's this kind of reactionary messianism in which all of the failings of the human will be corrected, right? And we, you know, and there's these kind of sort of salvation-based discourses, which I think happen a lot in AI, and the idea of, you know, this beneficent AI. And then, you know, and it goes the other way as well. And I really like the point about the fact that it could be the impulse towards ontotheology can, rather than being a reactionary puritanical move to reify the human, it can actually be a reaction against a different reification, which I think is what you're saying, of the human, which happens in behaviorism. And I really like that point, and that could be an exploratory point, you know, to get away from an externally, because that's what behaviorism is, right? It's an externally structured idea of the human in psychology, in order to find other definitions of the human and other prospects for the human. So I like the idea that this impulse could have a whole bunch of motives, right? And a whole bunch of different ends, right? Some of them are alarming, some of them are hopeful, and some of them are perfectly natural impulses. And I think this goes back to the problem of humanism, right? Is that we you know, it's one of those irresolvable philosophical problems. And, you know, post-humanism didn't help in some ways, you know. Now you've got somebody like Reza Negarestani theorizing inhumanism. So the idea of the human as a kind of sort of Peircean pragmatist project, which seems to be hopeful as well. So I like the idea of it going a whole bunch of ways. And when I think of behaviorism, I'm quite sympathetic to, I know this is not your point really, but just to pick up on it, I'm quite sympathetic to the impulses behind behaviorism in some ways. Behaviorism is totally out of vogue, you know, because we think of, you know, horrible experiments with dogs, which is what it was. And they're very, in some ways, unnuanced ideas about the human and how the human worked. But it also came from a really interesting desire for evidence-based psychology rather than a kind of non-evidence-based. It was kind of a reaction against psychoanalysis. and the idea that humans are constituted not simply by these sort of deep symbolic structures and by kind of Freudian ideas of the unconscious, but also by behavior. And I kind of love that because it materializes the human at some level. Like obviously the legacies of behaviorism didn't lead to these kind of more kind of utopian ends, but I think that there's this really honorable impulse in behaviorism as well. So it's you know, it's interesting that these and of course it's about how you constitute the human psyche and where you locate that. And I think it's interesting that these you could go a whole bunch of different ways. And I totally support your idea and like your idea about the ontotheological impulse actually being a sort of a retreat to perhaps an idea about the human that is not externally and materially bounded and exhausted. So yes, absolutely. Do you have anything you want to add to that? No.
I really enjoyed both papers, and yeah, this question is sort of about the fable and the alignment narrative and the apocalyptic thing. And originally, I guess when I saw the title of the paper, I was thinking about it. I was thinking, well, fables are often like those kind of social stories about where people are kind of on a similar kind of social level, and they've got to learn kind of the politics of interrelating. And I was thinking, well, the AI fables are about something that's completely incommensurate.
Yeah.
But then there's the lion in the fables, and the lion is sovereign and is exempt from the food chain and the evolutionary process. So I saw that suddenly just went click and made sense. So I just wanted, if you could say a bit more about this, the role of the lion in the structure of the fable and why that makes the alignment fable like an Aesopian fable, because I think the lion seems to be the really important character here.
Yeah. Absolutely, the lion is the AI, isn't it? And I think that's one thing. I also want to just, also make sure I'm not just knocking alignment theorists, because I might have sounded like I was knocking alignment theorists. Maybe I want to knock alignment fable. No, I don't want to knock anything. Not doing critique. But I think that one thing that the alignment fables really get at,
let me tell you my
and this is
verification
really important,
too.
and this is why I wanted to use the utility function as well, even though it's this kind of clunky, weird thing, like,
I'll
what are you
text this
doing?
to you
Don't do
now.
that. Don't import terms from AI into literary studies, there's, a kind of natural eye roll that you want to do, or that I sort of internally do when I do that. And I think there's good reason for it, but I wanted to go back to the utility function, the standard model of AI, because one of the things that's very easy to forget about is really old-fashioned power differentials, right? And power hierarchies. And that's one thing. We in addition to needing to historicize, we need to continually materialize, right? As well. And I think it's too easy not to do that. And I think now there's a lot of people doing kind of materialized work on AI and on the infrastructures, which create AI, how AI is a material thing using resources and engaged in things like resource acquisition. And in addition to that, the notion that superintelligence will have powers for resource acquisition that we can't quite fathom yet is really, really important. These realities that affect humans, that like my powers of resource acquisition is totally different from somebody in the global south, and the capacities of OpenAI to harness their money to socially engineer, all of these realities that affect us and shape the world will apply to superintelligence. And that's why the utility function is important. And I also think that we need to, it's really important to think about intelligence in a distributed sense, right? And often we think about intelligence in romanticized senses. And when we look at, if you look at the if you start to make notes on the ways in which human intelligence is represented in something like in animal fables and something like Aesop, you know, it's not flattering. Like the human is primarily defined by the capacity to construct deals, like, and to kind of play people, like, and I think that often we think about you know, and it's the same point as resource acquisition. You know, we don't think about intelligence in terms of capacities for resource acquisition because it's this kind of materialized function. But I think that all these things are in play in a really wonderful way in terms of morality and surprise and subversion in Aesop and in other animal fables. And they need to be brought back. You know, these dimensions of intelligence and interaction need to be brought back and foregrounded. And that's one really beneficial thing that the alignment fables do. They bring the lion back, right? And they ask us to think about the lion, and that's great.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So it was a lot to process and take in. It's not an area that I specifically work on or think about a lot. But I just wanted to bring in a question about dialogue and conversation. And I guess just thinking about the second paper that struck me as this kind of, I was thinking about questions of dualism and mind and body, and then the dialogue between them. But then I didn't see in the alignment discussion a lot of discussion of dialogue. And it seemed to me that the fables that you presented, one was more like asking a genie for a wish, where you only have one chance to say your wish, and then the genie goes off and changes the world. And then the other one where you basically have a set of interests at play, but it seems as though there's no opportunity for redemption or discussion or negotiation or anything like that in that fable. And I'm just wondering, within alignment theory, is there any chance of or is there any discussion about what is the role of dialogue and communication and seeing AI and doing that alignment thing as through a dialogical process rather than simply being like instruction, run off and do kind of thing?
I'll answer first. I think that, yeah, that's because one of the things is that the fable is working with a kind of ad nauseum structure, right? So we don't get a reasonable account of the paperclip, you know, manufacturing machine and the various considerations and updates and safety fixes and bug fixes and so on and so forth. Because what these fables are capitalizing on is and this is where the humor, like one thing I didn't get to talk about was dialogue and the other was humor. The humor of the fable comes from this radical disjunction between sort of paperclips and the end of the world, right? And it capitalizes on this disjunction. It capitalizes on this this sense of radical speed. And these go back to the Bostrom superintelligence, right? It's sudden, you know, it's not something that we can change, you know, it's exponential, right? We're going to lose control. All of this is about a loss of control, right? So hence there's no dialogue, there's no bug fixes because it's staging a loss of control, I think. So I think I think that pertains in banal ways to the form, right? Like be careful, you better act morally or there's going to be ruin, you know, not like, oh, you'll have, you know, better luck next time, you know, the fox is going to be eaten by the lion, we'll get runaway IA that we can't control and we don't fix. So and that's purely for banal didactic reasons. They want to scare people, you know, just like you want to, you know, maybe scare a 3-year-old, you know, with a lion eating a fox fable. So I think that's the purpose of the absence of dialogue. And of course, what these people are working on in tech is precisely that, the dialogue, right? They're working on building alignment strategies in these, you know, mega corporations. But I thought it was interesting as well because, you know, you talk about what, and this pertains to sort of the textual realities of the Aesop, is that in all the versions I could find, nobody says anything. It's reported speech, not actual speech. So I was a little worried when I was saying, you know, making those points about language. I was like, well, it's reported language, you know, it's not, but nonetheless, there's deal making, you know, that goes on and we hear about it. So, so the dialogue question is a really, really interesting one. And of course, there are, you know, things like updates and fixes, but in the threat scenarios, there isn't. And I guess one of the things, and that makes it kind of fantastical at some level, and it's meant to be, right? But I think at another level, what it's trying to get at is sort of Greek, it's hubris, right? That idea that we thought we understood something, that when we set a goal, we thought we understood it, and we didn't, right? Because there's another mind that we did not anticipate. And so even with dialogue and bug fixes and updating things and changing things, we actually have a very bracketed conception of what this thing thinks of in terms of goals and motives. So that's where I think it's also getting at.
Thank you for that question. Just very briefly, yeah, the essay China Brain is full of dialogue, and it's a pleasure of reading it. It's the beauty of it, and I think also the brilliance of it, that there is the dialogue between the patient and the technicians and various different technicians. There is the dialogue between the brain and the reader's brain. There's the dialogue at the end where she meets her friend in a noodle shop. So we get all of these levels of dialogue that grapple with this age-old question: what is the relation between the mind and the body? Which is, if you read Plato's dialogues, that's the question that's there. Or you know, one of the essential questions, and it makes you feel like we've never gotten past that question. But the great thing about Chu is that she's very funny with it all. So for me, there are laugh out loud moments, and the ending is just funny after all of this kind of dialogue. She just says this blithe thing about, well, maybe I wasn't getting enough salt, you know, and then that's the end. So this kind of blunt ending after this kind of, and this idea, which I think speaks interestingly to Bailey's interest in sort of these hierarchies that are reconstituted through these systems, that Chu's narrator and character is saying at the end, what if we were just all on the same level plane, you know, and everything was just for itself? And so that kind of thinking, that intelligencing that gets to, well, if you take away comparison, if you take away the measurement of one thing with another, maybe then hierarchy drops away, or the need for distinction drops away. So for me, that's, if we're thinking of Platonic dialogues and these questions, that's a sort of great place that the essay gets to at the end.
Just a final comment. I love that idea of the other minds. Where my mind went to is also the AlphaGo, and how surprised people were by the fact that the computer that learned to play that suddenly, you know, did what's called move 37, which I don't understand, but anyway, it just got away from the human. And so, yeah, there is that other instance of that. But what I've also seen in recent papers is this acknowledgement that alignment actually does only go so far, because there's still the possibility of that AI jailbreaking itself and becoming a lion. So I guess maybe the next step in the fable would be for someone to be able to short circuit the line and shut the line down.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. The other thing I thought was just, is the next step artificial experience as well? Because what these literary stories give you is the whole picture, the experience, not just the intelligence. But I thought that was beautifully framed in Andrea Long Chu's, was that, there is more. It's not just my brain, talking to you. There's a whole person. And so I thought that's an interesting thing to set beside utility function as well. And the focus on intelligence is the focus on experience. Yeah.
You want to say something? I mean, that'll be the last question, because we're at tea time. Maybe
I guess just very briefly, I'm not sure what artificial experience would be. I guess if that is what's in Chu's essay, then it's in all literature. I guess the sort of argument that I don't quite get to is that the literary is artificial intelligence, and I don't really know how to think about experience. So I'd be interested to hear more from you on that. Yeah.
And it's perhaps interesting that also the moments of experience in literature are sometimes that which is not narrated. I've been trying to work on George Eliot and motives in George Eliot, and there's these very intense moments in which the text changes in Middlemarch, and the plot goes a completely different way, and suddenly he's an engaged man. And it's like in Joyce, like in Dubliners, there's these moments of blankness and absence, and it's kind of interacting with the experience of the reader at that moment, but it's also the moment at which our brains, are perhaps only semi-conscious brains are what's running the show, which is very interesting. I'm interested in the way in which non-intentional behavior happens, and perhaps neural behavior in some senses happens in novels in places like George Eliot, and this is very interesting. We've sometimes got these kind of ideas about the novel is really fixated on personhood, which it is, of course, in the I, in the first person, and the growth of personhood, but it's also about the absences, the blue screen of death in personhood, as well. But I just wanted to comment really briefly on the chess thing, because of course the chess thing is almost like an AI fable. You start to get these AI fables, and the success of chess playing AI machines is so interesting, because of course everybody thought that once you could get a machine to play chess, that was it for humans, and there's all these kind of moments in which it's like, oh, this is it for humans, like once it can make paperclips, once it can do chess. And Douglas Hofstadter writes very beautifully about being terrified, and then it happened and life just sort of went on, and nobody somehow thought that chess playing was a trait of the human anymore, and wasn't bothered by it, So the human is actually very constructible, and often, our most tightly held ideas about what constitutes human intelligence are very banal and unimportant. And, my kids play chess with computers now, and, they haven't won yet. And and it's fascinating, anyway, yeah.
Well, thanks very much,
Thank you.
Monique and Bailey, for a great session. And yeah,